At the beginning of the video game industry for home consoles, there were a bunch of video games that were made for arcades that got moved over to home that didn't feel quite right. Sometimes the controls would be so different that it wouldn't give you the right feeling for how those games originally performed. Some companies out there would have actually made controllers specifically to play that game back at home that would completely be different from the original controllers bundled with the console. And some companies like Capcom released their very own that were very interesting to look at. This one is the Capcom Pad Soldier, and it's a 6-button controller for the Super Nintendo that's made for one specific game in mind. The Capcom Pad Soldier is a video game controller for the Super Nintendo that is kind of different compared to the original Super Nintendo controller. What makes it so interesting, though, is that it has 6 face buttons, which is typically something you would have seen on a Sega controller, not something on a Nintendo controller. Now, this controller itself isn't really made for games like Super Mario World and a whole bunch of other games released on the console. Instead, it really is focused on one specific genre, and that genre is fighting games. Now, if you were really going to be looking at one specific game from the entire lineup of fighting games you'll find on the Super Nintendo, you probably should be aiming at one game specifically, and that would be Street Fighter II. The version of Street Fighter II we're going to be looking at specifically, though, is Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting. Now, this version of the game is slightly faster than the original, but that's what we want, because with a controller like this, you should be able to push the buttons a lot faster than you typically would with a normal Super Nintendo controller. Now, if you were to use a real Super Nintendo controller to play Street Fighter, what ends up happening is that you have 6 buttons that you need to use at all times. That means that the shoulder buttons on the top of the controller are utilized as your 2 extra buttons that you don't have on the face. But this is what makes this controller so interesting. The Capcom Pad Soldier gets rid of the shoulder buttons and instead adds 2 extra face buttons. Now, those 2 face buttons are still the left and right shoulder buttons, but now they're just laid out in a different way. What makes this controller so interesting to use for gamers that are big on fighting games is that unlike you would typically have with a regular Super Nintendo controller, you're capable of pushing inputs a lot quicker than normal. This means that you can actually do combos a lot faster. Fighting game traditionalists typically like to use arcade sticks when they're playing fighting games, and the reason they like that is because these games initially were developed for the arcades and not for home use. Around the time they started trying to bring many of these games home, they found that the consoles of the era really didn't have a lot of buttons on them. And this was an issue because when it comes to games like Street Fighter II, it required the use of 6 face buttons. You could try to simplify the game by removing certain features and button inputs, but if you did that, you wouldn't be getting the real arcade experience. So that's what makes this gamepad so interesting. Now, while the Super Nintendo initially did have 6 buttons that you could use for game inputs, the problem was that 2 of them were shoulder buttons, and that gave you a different feel while you were playing the game. The way you hold the Gamepad Soldier is by gripping it with your left hand. This way, your thumb is kind of placed over the D-pad, giving you a very easy access way to move the D-pad around. But you also have the select and start buttons just above that are not too far out of reach. The X, Y, L, R, B, and A buttons are to the right, and what I find most comfortable is to use my index, middle, and ring finger to basically use all the buttons at once. On an original Super Nintendo controller, your index fingers would be pushing the shoulder buttons at the top, and that's pretty much all they'll be pushing because everything else is kind of out of reach for them. And with that original layout, you'd only be pushing the Y, X, B, and A buttons with your thumb alone. With this one, you have perfect access to pretty much all the buttons at the same time with 3 fingers. With the Gamepad Soldier, not only are you capable of inputting moves faster, but easier as well. That's what I love about this design, but there are a couple of issues. My big one is that, well, I kinda had a little bit of trouble using the controller and getting used to it, but it made me feel like I really wanted just a joystick on this thing. And unfortunately, it's not big enough to warrant something like that. And although I did like the face button layout, after a while it started to hurt my wrist and fingers because I just didn't find a comfortable way to use it. But I do know that there's a couple gamers out there that might find a way to use this and have a lot of fun with it, but for me personally, I really could only find one use for this, and that was playing fighting games, because with everything else, you're probably not going to be having the greatest time. Most Super Nintendo games are designed to use the original controller, and a layout like this might mean that games are designed that just don't work well with it. You might find 1 or 2 instances where there will be a game that was originally created for arcades brought to Super Nintendo that really doesn't use the shoulder buttons, and with games like that, you might have a lot of fun with this. But no matter what game I played, I just wanted that original layout design that you got with the original controller. If you're playing a fighting game out there and you need 6 face buttons, this might be the way to go, but I really feel that you might
might just not really prefer it. A lot of gamers out there that grew up with the original Super Nintendo controller might just crave this original design, and by using something that's very different, you might not be as comfortable as you once were. I really feel that Capcom designed this controller specifically for people that wanted that slight arcade experience at home without actually getting an arcade stick. And personally, that's who I'd recommend this controller to, because for everyone else out there that wants to play regular Super Nintendo games, you might find that this won't work well enough.
I wouldn't call this a bad controller because personally, I really don't think it is one. I think there's a lot of gamers out there that still play Street Fighter on the Super Nintendo and that might actually like using something like this. But for every modern gamer out there that wants to play Street Fighter on other devices and might find some way to get this to work on one of those things, I think you're better off just using an arcade joystick. They're easier to come by and they're probably a lot more fun.